the Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
Welcome back to the show. This episode is part of our Empathy Expansion Kit series. I'm Steven Sakach here once again with Tullio Siragusa.
Hey, everybody.
One of our main goals of our podcast is to help you build a more authentic business or work life. One of the best ways to do that is to build it with empathy, putting love and empathy into what you're doing. In this series, we are going to dive into some bite-sized topics on building empathy into your work life. Today, we dive into how to deal with resistance to change. If you're working toward a more empathetic workplace, you might be integrating some new systems, and there may likely be resistance depending on where you're at and where you want to go. So you've got to get buy-in. Tullio, you're pretty good at building buy-in. Surprisingly, where can be the biggest resistance for buy-in?
Surprisingly, the biggest resistance is usually at the top. There's fear of change, of losing control. Depending how someone kind of got up the ranks in their career, maybe they bought into this idea that you go up the ladder, and your goal is to be at the top of the ladder, and some of this stuff requires you kind of welcoming everyone else the ladder with you, instead of being at the top of the ladder. So that may be psychologically and emotionally hard for some executives to want to accept creating a more empathetic environment where they essentially create more of a shared authority in the organization. The challenge with that is that unless you do it, the newer generations are not going to want to work there. So what's happening now is, for a long time, you can get away with that and be like, yeah, that's okay. Even though the data suggests that it's better for the business, a lot of people resisted it. But now that resistance is a risk to the business, and it's a real risk. So, but it's not impossible. So you can do it in bite-sized chunks, right? That's one of the reasons I've also adopted force field analysis. It's a great way to get everyone to look at the resistance, the hindering forces and what's working. And then you put names associated with these forces. So it's not necessarily calling someone out, but as a group, you start to identify where the issues are. And sometimes the issue comes up that there's too much control, or what have you. But the one thing that's important to highlight is any organization that needs to go through this kind of transformation will require coaching. It's not going to happen just by adopting a bunch of tools and methodology, especially if it's a traditional hierarchical command and control work environment. They will not achieve this without some coaches that are going to help the leadership team work through the changes, the consciousness changes, and support also the teams to feel like they can contribute and their voices can be heard, right? Because some organization, people are afraid to speak up. It's like, is this a trick? So there's all these things that are real things. And we talked about in the last episode, only about 10% of businesses operate this way. So 90% are going to have to transform over the next few years, or no one's going to work for them. So it's a big challenge, but not an impossible task, with some coaching and some good methodologies and practices in place.
So the coaching, this is really, it's kind of just leadership for the leaders, right?
Yes.
And you've got to bring in some other voice, independent. There's no sort of resentment or anything brought in there. And you can kind of help them through that process. So what are you doing in that process?
Well, in that process, one of the key things is to have an open, raw conversation about what's working in the business and what's not working. And just talk about and identify all those areas that there's opportunity. And then look, okay, how do we tackle these areas where there are forces working against the business? Think of running a business is like moving a boulder up a hill, right? You got a bunch of people pushing this boulder forward. That's the stuff that's working for the business. And then you got all these other things pushing the boulder down the hill. You've got competitors, you've got market condition, you might have some inefficiencies in the organization, you might have some leadership that's not up to par where they need to be. These are hindering forces that are going to hold you back from pushing this boulder forward, right? So looking at those very honestly, very openly, and identifying them, and then coming up with a plan quarter by quarter on how to overcome all these hindering forces is part of this transformation. And it could take years. It's not something that happens overnight. And within that, you could then identify what are the things that people need, right? So there's the leadership training or coaching, and then what are the things the organization needs? And then there's the processes changes. If you do this all at once, it's too disruptive. You'll implode, right? So you have to do it in a step-by-step process. It's kind of like healing. If anyone's ever had a skin, God forbid, skin cancer, right? You don't just cut it out and it heals right away. There's a whole process. They graft, and it takes a long time to get the skin back to sort of normal. So it's kind of like that. You don't just go in and cut this thing out. You have to process by process, step by step, get to a place where you transform. And it's a big commitment, but it's worth it because it's not just good for the people, it's good for the bottom line.
Yeah, so some of the problems you're going to be running up against, it feels like you're dealing with a lot of pride here from people, right? And if everyone was, humble and open, it'd be pretty smooth sailing. That's not usually the case. You've got people who've done something this same way for, years and years and years, maybe decades or something, and now you're introducing some sort of change to them. One of the things that I like to use in all this is just give me data. Is this going to work? And I think so. Anytime you're building some sort of empathy into your business, there's probably some research out there that is going to show you that, hey, yeah, you're on the right course. So here's just a few data points overall on just building empathy into the workplace. So according to Harvard Business Review, they revealed that companies that actively foster empathy and emotional intelligence in the workplace outperform others as much as 20%. So this is just a general sort of stat, hey, we're going to probably outperform our peers by doing this. Another study, there's so many studies on this next one, it's 93% of employees say they're more likely to stay with an empathetic employer. I've seen just study after study talking about the importance of being an empathetic employer and whether you're going to have churn with your employees or not ties directly into this. It's a huge one. Catalyst study found that when employees perceive their leaders as more empathetic, teams were more likely to report being innovative. So 61% versus 13% for teams with less empathetic leaders. All kinds of stats and data out here. That's usually like where I like to start, just because it's, again, it's nothing personal, right? It's not something that we've got some sort of resentment we build up, or we're doing things this same way. We're like, hey, this is what our competition is either going to do or are doing now. How can we stay, ahead of them or stay with them? Tullio,
And that's the thing. The resistance often comes from lack of knowledge or downright ignorance, right? So once you educate yourself on what are the data points for this, then it becomes very relevant that you realize, if I'm a CEO of a company and I want it to perform well, and I have some data points that suggest that I can increase my performance exponentially by implementing some changes that have nothing to do with the product or the service. It has everything to do with the culture. Why would I be against that? So it's a conscious shift to say, okay, are you running a business where it's all about you? Or are you running a business where you want to succeed and be a good steward to the success of the organization? Because you can still make it about you, but now you can adapt principles that also help you be successful in what you do. And in the process, create a more caring, empathetic organization. But those leaders will still need coaching through it, though.
They will. So
they will. They have to.
Yeah, one of the things you can do to make these changes less threatening is you can call them, pilot programs, something like that, so people kind of can dip their toes in.
With the vision.
Yeah. Another thing, celebrate successes. So whenever you've got some sort of success related to what you're doing there, celebrate it, bring it up. This is going to help build momentum. And that's what you really need, getting something going like this. So lastly, and if something isn't, you've worked on it, it's not just sticking organically, try something new. You can ditch it. If you're a leader, you can you can drive things only so far, but if it's not working, it's not working. And the goal here is to make it real, to make it authentic. And occasionally things aren't going to work. So if you want it to be authentic, you got to be able to discard and continue to move forward. And
two things I want to say.
Yeah.
Be patient and be humble. Those are the two things that will get you through all these experiments.
Absolutely.
Be patient and be humble. Absolutely necessary.
Not just in work, but in your life.
True.
And onward we go. That's it for today's episode of our Empathy Expansion Kit series. We'll see you on the next Bliss Business podcast.